The stories you are about to hear are all first-hand true life encounters I experienced as a child and later teen exorcist and miracle worker. As a tongue-talking, spirit-slaying, word and faith child minister, I personally performed well over 75 exorcisms before the age of 18. Many of these stories are horrific in nature, many hilarious, but all are embarrassing. This podcast is for adults only, as these stories are disturbing, and I do like to say the word fuck a lot. Make sure to stay tuned at the end of this podcast, where I have a fairly lengthy conversation with one of my best friends who were very present and very involved in this failed, botched exorcism. Well, I've been sitting here for about 30 minutes. I completely just realized that I am self-sabotaging. I really don't want to do this episode. I have a Google Doc that tracks a bunch of the different stories that I want to tell, and I keep skipping over this one because I just really hate this story. But I was meditating a little bit, and I was reminded of when something like this, when I find myself avoiding something, I really need to run to it. I typically feel so much better, and it tends to be one of those things that I really need to experience in my life. And so let's get into it. It was 1995. I graduated high school in 1994, and at this time in my life, I had been running frontline outreach, which had been just completely successful, completely radically changed my life socially and the way that I was viewing myself. But all that was coming to an end. I had just graduated high school, and most of my friends, in fact, almost all of my friends but one, all moved away within like a day or two of each other. And, next thing you know, I don't have my ministry that was all of my identity and my value. And I'm at my parents' church, which I had already been running a little bit thin on. I was already having a hard time. It was still very much the 80s style kind of church where everything was satanic panic and, word and faith and name it and claim it, and yet everybody was broke and everybody was sick and everybody was desperate. And I was really growing tired of that. I had been having a different spiritual experience through Frontline. So it's a Sunday morning, and, just so you understand, my parents' church was never a wealthy church at the time. The city that we were in, which was Allen, Texas, a suburb of Dallas, that was a country town that was growing. And so my parents had these little churches that would pop up in shopping strips, and in old shopping strips, not like something brand new, something nice. We had metal chairs until we got some that had cushions on them. That was a big thing. Everything on the inside was built from volunteers. So don't get the impression that this was, Cadillacs and, private jets. However, those were the people that we were imitating and looking towards for counsel. The Kenneth Copelands, the Robert Tiltons, the Jesse Duplantis, the Creflo Dollar, the list goes on and on. Yes, that's his real name, Creflo Dollar. And so Sunday mornings, in any church, that's the big show, that's the big thing. My mom had been really on a major run at speaking a lot. My parents were co-pastors. This was very important. This was pretty much unheard of at the time, but they were co-pastors, and that was made abundantly clear pretty much every time my dad ever got in a pulpit. He was always overcompensating to make sure that my mom was included, or that my mom was actually speaking and preaching that service. They shared a lot of it. The division of labor, my mom tended to be more on the pastoral counseling, deliverance, marriage side, of course. And my dad was the pastor, going and visiting the sick, going to the funerals, keeping men accountable and always preparing for the services and stuff like that. And so Sunday morning, I was the de facto youth pastor. So Frontline Outreach, when it started in the high schools, they were just Bible studies that would happen before and after school in a classroom. they grew so fast that we started needing to have all of the schools come together on a Thursday night, and we used my parents' church for that, which only makes sense. It was free. Everything we needed was there. It was in Allen. So as a byproduct of that, there was a lot of blurring of the lines from frontline outreach, which was solely my ministry, and well, not my parents and mine, but just mine and the people that I was running it with, Jared, Tammy, Sam, these kind of people, and Luke. The list goes on and on. Over time, the lines began to blur, and people that were coming to Frontline started coming to my parents' church. People that would come to my parents' church started coming to Frontline. And in that blurring, there were a lot of amazing people. You know, there were people that I'm intentionally not naming because I've already talked with them and they don't want their name to be mentioned. But at the end of this this podcast, towards the end, you're going to hear a conversation with one of these people, one of my absolute best friends that was super involved in pretty much all of the ministry things that I was doing, went to my parents' church. And he was one of these guys, he was all in, he was fully committed. If the doors were open, he was there. If there was some shitty work that needed to be done, he would do it. He was one of those guys that really, you know, is what churches are built off of. They're built off of backs like this guy and, you know, all the different people that love and want to just be a part of something they think is exciting and making a difference. And so Sunday mornings, it started getting pretty big with just a combination of people coming and going, a lot of different people that I know. And this particular Sunday morning, you know, we have praise and worship, and you know, I don't really remember why, but I do remember that my mom had been really upset, not upset, screaming, yelling like I've mentioned before, but upset like she seemed to have learned of something really bad within the last couple of days. And later on, I found out that there was a lady that was coming to our church, a very sweet lady who I won't name, who had been married, had a few kids. That husband abused her and left, and then she remarried someone, and this guy was very much like the street Christian street minister, got saved off the street, like meth addict, heroin addict, got saved. So, you know, people that are into like street ministry, they're just that really raw, you know, they're kind of seen as like the crazy prophet standing on the street corner, screaming and yelling that, you know, that you need Jesus. And this guy was a good dude. He was an usher, but because of his addictions and things, my parents were always keeping him kind of at bay, which was the right call. So, come to find out, this new husband had, they had been married for a while. He had become the father of the two boys from the previous marriage, and then that they had had a daughter themselves. And he had become really abusive, primarily to the oldest son. This oldest son was around 12 or 13 when this took place, and he was pissed. I mean, he was mad as shit. He was angry. Every time you try to talk to him, he would basically just look at you like, go fuck yourself, you know? And, you know, for us, coming from the kind of ministry that I was in, that was a challenge. That was not a, hey, let's give this guy some space. That was not a, let's just kind of love him through it. It was a challenge. I would begin praying and taking communion and, you know, binding demonic activity that's influencing him, and, you know, fasting and praying in tongues and all these kind of things, and in what we called interceding for him. And, you know, that's an interesting concept. Here's a person, a kid, who is mad because his parents are divorced and because he's getting beat by someone. And what we are praying for is, you know, we're rebuking like demons of rebellion, right? Excuse me. So, complete mismatch of problem and solution, right? So, but my mom had recently been meeting with this lady, and she was talking about how bad the abuse had gotten, how bad the drug use was starting to get, and this was becoming a problem. Later on, I actually wound up going, and I'll tell the story at another time. I wound up going over to their house with my dad and another gentleman who has now passed away, but I'm good friends with his daughter to this day. And we physically removed that man from the house. I was 19, 20 years old. And we went in there and literally physically moved him out with a suitcase, you know. So this still was going to start escalating, but this was early on. And he was given opportunity after opportunity, pastoral counseling, not court appointed counseling. There weren't police reports filed. He was not going to a licensed therapist. Nobody had a PhD hanging on their wall of any sort. And so these things escalate to a dangerous level while we are believing that it is demonic. These people are not being taught to be accountable for themselves. They're not being empowered. They're realizing that they're pieces of shit. They're always going to be pieces of shit, and that they need to submit to this thing that they cannot see, and that there's all these rules, and a lot of it's really confusing. But hey, bro, it's totally free, right? So it's a very dangerous situation when you're dealing with addiction and mental health issues. Very, very dangerous. And as a result, just one of the results of this situation being mishandled is on back to the Sunday morning. My mom was preaching that morning, and my mom had a way of, most pastors do this, but my mom did it a lot, to bring into her message, whatever it is, whatever she's prepared for. She would bring in current events, things that were basically pissing her off. So if she was having a hard run with the men hating and men are pigs, that would inevitably leak into every message. So much so that people left the church over it. People would talk about the men bashing that would happen from the pulpit on a Sunday morning while you're sitting there with your wife and your kids. But this particular morning, because she had been learning about the abuse and everything, so she's up there speaking, and there's the wife who has confided in her. There's the husband that's doing the beating, the abusing, and there's the children. And we have praise and worship. My mom gets up and gives kind of like a word. Now, what that means is that God, through the Holy Spirit, has impressed something on you so much that you're going to stand up, and it's for the congregation. It's for everyone there, and you're going to speak it. If you've never experienced this, it's very, very traditional Pentecostal for someone to get up. So much so, most of the churches that I grew up in had a microphone stand up in the front with a hot mic on it, that anybody could go up at any time and grab that. And they could prophesy, they could give a word, they could read a scripture. Now, depending on your church congregation, there was always those crazy shits that were going to get up there and do something nutty. So there was either an usher or a church leader that was up there. So you would walk up, tap that person on the shoulder, whisper in their ear what you feel to share, and that person would pray about it and tell you whether or not you could get up there and do it. I had that job for years. Crazy shit. Like some really crazy stuff that people wanted to share. And sometimes, depending on the day and how late I was up the night before, what I was watching, how many times I had watched Predator the night before, or whatever I was obsessed over watching, I would just, for shits and giggles, be like, yeah, you should probably get up and say that. I got to hear how you're going to say this. So, God knows how many people I'm responsible for hearing really fucked up shit. But the point is, my mom gives a word, and the word is along the lines of men abusing their power, of men taking advantage of men, and everyone's becoming very uncomfortable, and you just kind of have a feeling that she's talking to someone. Then they do the tithe, the offering time, and all that, and they release the kids to go into Sunday school. Now, this church was so small. It was such a little shitty location. It was actually a retail strip that was broken into two different parts. One was up high and one was down low, and we had to make stairs between the two sides. One side had an industrial kitchen in it that we didn't need, and it was huge. So that became the Sunday school room, was the industrial kitchen. I mean, again, the word and faith part, the prosperity part, just never really took root in our church. And so we had a couple volunteers in there. One of the volunteers is who you will hear at the end of me talking on this podcast. Now, as I remember it, and again, it's been hazy. I think my buddy here will probably remember the details much better. But what I remember is someone coming in and whispering to me or to one of the ushers that there was a boy that was having a problem. He was starting to yell, starting to get really upset, and they needed some backup. They needed some help, which is what ushers are for. They are meant to be the first line of defense if somebody's doing something weird, right? Whether it's safety, security, spiritual, whatever. And then the usher's job is to figure out who to go to, how to distribute, and who's going to handle the situation. I can tell you that out of all of the crazy demon stuff that I ever experienced, this one has stuck with me in a way that's different because there are things that I can't explain. There are things that I think there are scientific explanations for. And if they are scientific explanations, the fact that I witnessed them are still staggering and still amazing. So I'll tell you my point and my perspective of it, and then we'll hear the other perspective, because the gentleman you're going to hear here in just a minute, I believe he was the teacher in the room when this was happening. So I walk in and I can hear growling. I hear like a rustling, growling sound. And this young man who stepfather was beating him, and later we found out a lot of other things, but I can't confirm that, so I'm going to avoid it a little bit. But there was plenty of reason and plenty of conversation later around sexual abuse, of course. But he was so angry that he was growling. Now, I'm talking about, I think I said he was around 12 or 13. I honestly don't know. I think it was probably more like 11. But he is in there growling, like, growling. And this Sunday school room is full of other kids that are just sitting there like, what the actual fuck is happening? And he is growling. I don't know how else to explain it, but it is like a cornered, mad, pissed off dog. And it was like he had gone primal, and he was warning everyone to stay the hell away from him. Well, in our church, that only meant one thing. And this was a demon manifesting, literally manifesting. It's so funny, The Secret and all these things came out talking about manifesting and the power of manifesting, which I am a huge believer in. The Bible is chock full of it. I practice that in my life to this day. It's just not the way that it's typically taught. But to me, manifesting, you talk about a triggering term. When I hear manifesting, it means a demon is beginning to take over a person's will, is taking over a person's body, very much like what you saw in The Exorcist, where the person becomes enslaved to this entity that is inside of them. And I walk in and I see a young boy sitting there growling, looking like he's about to eat someone. I don't remember again who did what. I just remember that they went in and they got all of the big boys. They came in rolling deep. We had one gentleman who was the gentleman that we later went and kicked this guy out of his house. He was one of the coolest people I've ever known. Just a giant of a man. I forget. I think he was 6'6", probably 350 pounds, linebacker. Before he had become a Christian, he had been basically an enforcer of sorts in a lot of different kinds of business. He was huge, and he had a heart of an absolute teddy bear. I mean, just sensitive and sweet and kind. Of course, my dad is up there now speaking. I think it was I'm pretty sure my dad was up there speaking, and so they went and got the ushers first. So they brought in big boy number one, who I was just talking about. They brought in another gentleman who was pretty freaking big. And again, I'm talking big grown-ass men. My buddy who you're going to talk to here or hear from in a minute, he was a pretty damn good-sized dude at the time, too. And my mom, who's like, 5'4", 115 pounds, soaking wet, right? But she was that little Spitfire assassin. So they come in, and they're trying to talk to this kid. He will not respond. He's growling. He's just starting to say things under his breath. If you were there, you'd be like, I think this dude's manifesting. The reality is, he was a pissed off, hurt kid, and he was feeling ganged up on. And we began laying hands on him and trying to cast this demon out of him. And I think we started with a demon of hate, or a demon of rage, or a demon of rebellion. Rebellion was typically a starting place, because rebellion is, how you open yourself up. That's like one of the easy ways to corner someone. Is rebellion opens you up to all kinds of demonic activity. This young man started becoming more physically pissed and upset, to where it looked like he was about to punch my mom. And the big dudes, I mean big dudes, bigger than me now at 44 years old, they grabbed an arm. They each grabbed an arm of this little kid and started restraining him. And it freaked him out. And he started screaming. He started crying. I just want to go. I just want to go. I just want to go. Ah. And my mom is trying to cast a demon out of him. She's yelling louder and louder and louder. And I'm standing there with my hand on him, screaming, yelling like a fucking idiot. Now, what I'm about to tell you, you're going to completely think I'm full of shit. And I get it. I totally get it. But that young boy, 11, 12, 13, there's no way he was over 13 years old. He might have been completely younger. I don't know. We'll find out. But the point is, he had these two big-ass guys restraining him and holding him. And he began to sling those guys around. Now, for us, that was proof that there was a demon. He had supernatural strength. Pretty sure he hadn't had any like PCP or anything like that, but that's what it was like. You hear these stories where people are high on some crazy shit and they're like eating people's faces, and you'll hear policemen talk about how it took like 6 or 7 guys to take down some dude that's like, 150 pounds. That's what it was like. He was a little kid. He was even small for his age, I believe, but that could be me just making it dramatic in my mind. But he was moving these guys. They were holding on with both hands, big ass bear mitt hands, and he was slinging these guys around, screaming, and they are freaking out. Metal chairs are smashing into each other. I mean, it sounded like a war zone in there. And, to us, that was proof of demonic activity. So they just amp it up. You pray louder, you pray harder, you just keep going. In reality, guys, I'm serious. I think he had such an adrenaline rush. I think this was one of those when you hear the story about the grandma who lifted a car off of her grandkid when it fell on him or something like that. It was like superhuman strength, man. I'm telling you. He had like an adrenaline dump, and he was tossing one of those guys I know for a fact was at least 350 pounds. And he was flipping these guys all over the place, man. They were holding on like they were riding a bull. It was insanity. And I look over, and my friend, who you're going to hear in a few minutes, he has this look on his face I will never forget. He's looking, and he looks over at me like, I think this is pretty fucked up. And I remember kind of just looking at him, like shaking his head like, no, keep going. It's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. And that situation, I'm pretty sure, has haunted him for the rest of his life. You see, my buddy, he was raised Catholic. He was raised with a bunch of brothers. He was raised very, 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 very all-American. You do the right thing, duty-bound, that kind of guy. Great dude. He worked and had a stable job from the time he was like 16, right? He's been in the same company now for over 20 years. He's one of those guys. And he had left that world and come into the hyper-emotional, hyper-literal, over-the-top, we are trying to save people from hell. And it was the by all means necessary. The ends justify the means kind of we're at a war. Spiritual warfare. And so he stands there and just keeps praying. And I will never forget. There's a lot about this that I don't forget. But I will never forget the look on that guy's face. He just looked like, this is fucked up. And this is one of the things that I want to point out. There's this concept of a newborn Christian, a baby Christian, a young Christian, all the way up to a mature Christian. And that comes from the Apostle Paul writing letters and people talking in the Bible about, when they're young, you got to give them milk, meaning simple teachings. And as they get older, you can increase it. You can't live off of milk forever. At some point, you got to grow up and you got to really deal with the harder parts of the Bible. It's an intrinsic, we're better than you, exclusive. I mean, come on. It's just classic. It's humanity over and over and over. How are we better than you? Right. And so I really had that attitude in a major way. And here I am. I'm thinking the young Christian, this guy, he doesn't understand what it takes and what we're doing. But in reality, he's sitting there being taught to ignore his instincts, which is always, always part of these cult-like experiences. And, he now has had to live with the guilt of standing by and watching that. Because I tell you right now, this guy today, he'd kick someone's ass if he saw anything even remotely close to it. And so, as I got older and older and older, we kind of always thought about this situation. Now, the way that ended up, I mean, it became a full-on, the people in the congregation through the little cheap-ass, walls, they could hear the screaming, the yelling. He's crying. His mom is standing over in the corner just kind of crying and praying and, oh, my baby, and all this kind of stuff. And I don't even mean to mock her. She was in a horrible, horrible situation. So as I typically have, and I've learned as I've been trying to record these stories, I really do try to be as accurate as I can. But the flat out fact of the matter is I can't remember a lot of this stuff. And what I do remember, it's important to know that it's how I experienced it. It's how I remembered it. The emotional impact of this kind of stuff is much deeper than what you're seeing at face value, obviously. So as I got older, this became one of those things that I carried so much guilt over. I love kids. I have always loved kids. If you've ever been around me, if I could be Willy Wonka, that would be my dream. Like I want to find ways to build people up. I love reminding people of who they are and building and encouraging them, especially when they're younger. For so many reasons, probably because of the way that I grew up, and it's all common sense. So to do something like this to a kid that I later learned, at the time I didn't know any of this, but I don't have all the exact details. I'm actually actively trying to find him. I have heard that he's spent a couple of times in and out of prison for some pretty horrific crimes. I could be wrong, like I was going to share what they were, but since I don't know exactly what they were, I'm just going to leave them out. If they're even remotely true, he went on a continued path, a trajectory of just spreading death and spreading hate and the anger. It's my deepest desire to find and be able to try to connect with him in some way. But I don't know. I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't even know if it's the right thing to attempt. I'm not an expert. I'm just kind of doing this. I have no idea if it's a right idea or not. But, that experience definitely lent itself towards my buddy here I'm about to talk to, moving away from that style of church for sure. Like when he left there, I'm pretty sure he was like, all right, this is some nutty shit. We later had to, get this dad out of there. Nothing ever changed. The guy kept abusing, abusing drugs, abusing children, abusing his wife, on and on and on. And so we never got these people help. We never did. And I realize that if people that do pastoral counseling hear this, that, I can hear your heart. I understand it. I remember my parents staying up all hours of the night. They didn't do that out of ego. They did that out of true compassion, out of empathy, wanting to help people. But pastoral counseling is one of the main ways that people get repeatedly traumatized over and over and over, because everything is a spiritual issue. Every problem, the answer is Jesus. Every issue, the problem is sin. There is never a learning to, one, rely upon yourself and understand who you really are. And two, you're never really dealing with the root issues. You're always dealing with these spiritual issues, which I will grant you this, they are at least reflections, but they are symptoms. It's the reverse of what they teach. They say that anxiety is a symptom. The real issue is that you need Jesus. And then that guy accepts Jesus, gets rid of all of his porn, gets rid of all of his rated R movies. If he was radically saved, he gets rid of his PG-13 movies. He throws away all of his music. He purges. He cleans himself up. He spends all of his free time reading the word and dissecting the scripture and praying and interceding, and he only listens to praise and worship, and yet he still has anxiety. What do you think happens to that guy? He doesn't think, well, maybe this is not what I thought it was. No, he assumes, because it's the way they've been programmed, he assumes that it's him. He assumes that he is sinning, that he's doing something wrong. He's not believing the right way, and that's why he is still experiencing anxiety. It's very, very dangerous. It leads to suicide. It leads to murder. It leads to sexual abuse and rape and ritual abuse. It continues on because we have this thing where you just go to your pastor for everything because they're not going to teach me this crazy philosophical, scientific shit. That is how we have gotten to the place we're at now, to where people can sit around and ignore facts, because that is what we have been teaching as faith. And now, as a society, we largely are ignoring hard, proven facts because we have become so polarized. You're either evolution, atheist, fact-based, or you are faith, trust-based. But you can't have any blend of the two. And so now we are in this complete, circus of a society. And this is kind of the way that it happens. It happens every day, all day, every day, piece after piece. Everyone's being affected from these little pocket events. People are learning to not trust their instincts. People are learning to not trust authority. People are learning that, they're pieces of shit, and this happened because they sinned. People are learning that the more people sin and the more people abuse them, that must be something that God's wanting to reveal in your life. It is a fucking cancer. It is a cancer. And I experienced it on such traumatic levels with children that now I'm trying to find these people, and it's hard to find them because more than one of them are in prison now. That's not an accident. And I know the difference between correlation and causation, and I get it. But man, we systematically traumatized children and left and would go on a Sunday and have lunch and feel like we were these noble people that were doing good on this planet. And I don't want to make light of it in any way. I don't want to make any jokes. But I do want you to understand from my perspective of living my whole life dealing with demons and all that, of just finishing this, this youth ministry that had been really successful and had really blown up. And at the time I was thinking I'd done all these amazing things for people. I was traveling and speaking and all this stuff was going on. I'm standing there thinking, we got a live one, motherfucker. Like, this is the real deal. This is not somebody's having a bad day and they're feeling poopy, so they're going to have no. This was one of the times where I was convinced we were dealing with a demon in a kid. And the only reason I was convinced was because I saw him tossing around these grown-ass, big-ass men. But as always, there are other explanations, and most people would have started with the other explanations instead of going straight to, oh, they got an Arnold Schwarzenegger fucking demon in there that's just like flexing, it's crazy because that was the first thing for us to assume. There was nothing else. And by the way, it never crossed anybody else's mind that any of this was wrong, other than my friend who you're going to hear. Nobody else afterwards was like, okay, that was fucked. We need to figure out what to do. None of that. again, we all were kind of like, we've done something amazing today. You're almost humbled because you feel like you have made such a difference in a person's life. Like, I can't, I'm not exaggerating. You feel and you believe that you just saved someone from a burning fucking car. You know those 80s, the classic car, the A-Team thing, right? Like the car spins out of control, and every time a car crashes, it always has to do what? It has to explode. Every time the cars explode. It doesn't matter why, they explode. I grew up thinking every car was going to explode if I hit like a speed bump too hard. And if you saw that and you ran over there and you bust the glass and you pull the person out, and just in time it blows up behind you and you hit the ground and you're like, I saved this life. That's really what it was like, guys. That's really what we thought we were doing. We thought we were saving people in the nick of time. People would call us to come to their house to cast out demons at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I mean, it was like Ghostbusters kind of shit. But we were serious. We really thought that was our life. And, you know, you take my friend, just a few months before this, he had been sitting in a Catholic church. You know, no such thing as exorcism in the Catholic church he was going to in wealthy West Plano. And now he's standing here watching us hold down a kid, and that kid toss everyone around screaming and yelling, which, you know, in our mind, it was like we were hearing him yell in Latin or some shit, but he wasn't. He just wanted to be left the fuck alone. Now, this is going to be really interesting. A few weeks back, I mentioned this to my buddy, just saying, hey, I'd like to hear what you remember, but we didn't really go through it. So I'm going to call him right now. I'm going to record just the phone call, and let's hear his perspective on the event. What up, yo?
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. What's up?
Sorry.
That's
Just
right.
getting in my truck, leaving the office. I figured I didn't want to be sitting in my office and someone walk in and hear me talk about demon possession.
That might be a bit odd. So I guess the easiest way to transition is, you obviously know what I've been doing with the podcast. So I've been avoiding doing this episode in particular because it's just, I think it's one of the worst of my stories. You know,
It was odd.
just start from the top. Like you're sitting at a bar and you're like, oh, I got to tell you this story. Like tell it the way that you remember it, and I won't interject.
So, I was the children's pastor at the church, and or the led children's ministry. I wouldn't even call myself a pastor.
Yeah.
I guess I was helping out
At my parents' church.
at your parent church. Yes,
Yeah.
and so I was just standing back as the I'd become one of the greeters. You came and grabbed me, and we go back to because it was like a converted office space, and there was a young man curled up on the floor. Your parents were speaking in tongues, praying over him.
Yeah.
And I think you grabbed me, and we're standing around, and this kid just, from my perspective, just wanted to leave the church. He kept saying, I want to go. And I said, what's going on? And either your mom or dad said, we're casting a demon out of him.
Yeah.
And at this point in my life, you know, I didn't know what demon possession perceptually was. So it was kind of a new concept.
What? You didn't understand that?
No.
Yeah.
And so I look over at you, and you have this really serious face, and you're trying to pray for him. So there's somebody else in the room too. I can't remember who it was. It was probably another greeter. and we're blocking the doors. This poor little kid. I shouldn't laugh because it was very, like, when it was going down, it was nuts.
Yeah, you
And,
laugh because it's so uncomfortable, man. It really
yeah,
is. Just to say it
it
out
was.
loud, you're like, holy shit.
And so I was a big guy, so I'm blocking the door for this kid who he just kept saying, "I want to leave," is what I remember. I want to go, and then he just curled up on the ground because these adults wouldn't let him leave the church, and they're casting demons out of him. And we prayed. It was. I don't know who was preaching at the time. Your parents were in there. The other.
Yeah, the elder, the big dude.
Elder.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you and I. So who was leading church? I don't know.
I thought my dad was in there. I thought my dad was preaching.
No,
But
he was in the room with.
no, you're right. That's one of the times where they like tagged me. I went out there and finished. This is classic between you and I. So I pull you into the situation, and about halfway through it, I leave and I go out there and I finish the service, and I leave your ass in there with the freak show.
It was, and I just remember standing there going, looking at your parents, going, I don't know if I should be in here. This is weird. This kid just wants to leave.
Yeah.
I felt bad for him. I didn't, and then afterwards, your parents gave me some crazy books because I said, "What is demonic possession?" Because I was.
Oh boy.
Yeah, so they gave me some weird books to read, and so I read them just because I'm a reader.
Yeah.
And I read them in like 2 days because it just happened. And I told you later. I remember looking at you and go, "That was really weird." I think is a term, and you said, "Yeah, but it's you said it's demon possession," and I just remember thinking, "Was it? The kid just wanted to leave.
Yeah.
Like he just wanted to go."
Yeah.
And then I was going to community college, and I was taking a philosophy of comparative religion class, and there's a Southern Baptist preacher that was teaching the class.
Oh,
he did
shit.
a really good job of talking about all these, world religions, and I asked him about it, and he just says, "Well, some people believe that." That was kind of his, but the kid was emotional, obviously. I mean, I can't remember how old he was, but he had to have been 14, maybe.
Was he?
He was young. He was.
I know he wasn't in youth group age, and I know he wasn't in middle school age because he was in the Sunday school room.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that probably is right. I just remember. I mean, and he'd come a couple of times. He'd sit real quiet in church.
Mhm.
I guess his mom was dragging him to church.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the things that's interesting is obviously we tell the story differently as far as in, the way leading up to it and all that. There's a couple other things I remember, and I don't, tell me if you remember this or if you don't, but do you remember the other big dude that was trying to hold him?
Oh,
Do you
on the
remember?
ground? Yes.
Okay, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
He was being restrained on the floor when I first walked in the room.
Yeah.
And then by the time you left, though, he was just curled up on the floor because, some big dude pinned you down.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, he was restrained when I walked in the room. But then when, some of it's kind of fuzzy just because it was such a weird.
Yeah.
I just remember thinking, this kid doesn't want to be here. I don't want to be in this room right now.
Yeah.
It didn't feel right, to be perfectly honest.
Well, that's because your soul was intact and we were abusing someone. Yeah. I mean,
right.
It's what's crazy about that is you're there, you weren't raised in that hyper emotional religion. You weren't raised in all of that crazy, satanic panic kind of shit. So you don't have any context for it. But also what was happening is because this kid was just pissed off about his mom being married to, frankly, a dude that was an asshole at the time. My parents took that as a spirit of rebellion. And then when he would refuse to get up off of the floor, that was the demon basically like really, taking over and was manifesting this rebellious spirit. Yeah.
Yes, I can't remember exactly because your mom looked at me, and I'm sitting there, standing in front of the door, so he couldn't leave. I'm laughing because I feel terrible about it.
I know.
I've kind of talked a little bit here and there. I just remember telling you repeatedly years later, going, I really feel terrible about this.
Yeah, I know.
But your mom yelled at me, pray harder.
Oh, yeah.
like I wasn't being spiritual enough.
Yeah.
And praying for this kid who just wanted to leave church.
Yeah. See,
I feel bad for laughing about it because it's such an awkward.
Well, I've had enough conversations along these lines with people now that you have to laugh, and that's why there has to be disclaimers. I mean, the laughter is discomfort and disbelief. It's not, hey, that was fucking hilarious. We tormented this kid. You know, I mean,
and myself now, you know, I had been 18, 19 years old, and your parents were always really nice to me, and you know, I saw an opportunity to help, and it was fun, but that was definitely a really weird. I didn't, you know, of course, you get called into a room and have no context of
right.
Why is this kid on the ground? And I remember thinking, he said he just wants to leave. Why don't we just let him leave?
Yeah.
Like he doesn't want to be here.
But see, you were just a newborn baby Christian. You didn't understand, like that. You see, that's that newbie stuff, right?
Yeah, I didn't understand the demonic possession, and so they were nice, but kind of put me in my place. Like you just do your role. You do, and but yeah, years later, that is one of my biggest regrets that I didn't help that. You know, when he said he wanted to leave, Tim now would have been like, hey, we need to let this kid leave. He doesn't want to be here. Is Tim now? Of course, I probably wouldn't be. You wouldn't be in church like that now. Yeah, and if somebody told me about it now, I go, you shouldn't have let that kid. You know, Tim now goes, why didn't you let him leave? Why don't you? It's just I feel. You know, hindsight's always 20/20, and when you're an adult, you look back at some of the stuff and you go, I should have handled it different.
Yeah.
I handled it best I think I could, and then I will say I've never cast a demon out of anybody since then.
Yeah.
Even going to school and getting a theology degree and was involved for ministry for a few years, I never believed that to be a course of action that was needed.
Yeah. Slacker.
I think your parents really cared about him.
Yes. No, they did.
I think it came. Granted, it's a screwed up place.
Yeah.
But from their perspective, they were caring about this family, caring about this kid's well-being, but did it in a really screwed up way. It was, you know, I mean, the passion in your mom's eyes to help this kid was, I believe, sincere.
It was very real.
It was misplaced.
Yes, and
the term I used.
I mean, you remember the adrenaline in the room, and that's one of the things I try to communicate when I talk about these things. Is there is an adrenaline rush, like you're a first responder to a car crash. There is there's somebody lit a fuse. We have got to get this guy. In this case, we have got to save this kid, or he is going to die.
And it was partially my fault because I was not being intense enough.
Right. Dude, you were such a fucking slacker, man. Like, these demons aren't going to just, like, up and leave, dude. Come on.
Why are you not praying harder? What is wrong with you?
Yeah, yell, motherfucker. Yell. Shit. Well, you know, but here's one of the things I'm realizing. Obviously, this boy was traumatized. And I'm actively trying to find him, to apologize, and if I do, I'll let you know. But, you know, one of the other things... There goes my ringtone again. Did you hear that?
No.
That's hilarious. One of the other things that I'm learning is that trauma is not only just the person. Like, you were traumatized being in that room. Like,
I've told you many times, like, when we've gotten together throughout the years since then, I've always told you that's bothered me.
Yeah. The
way we handle it. Would you quickly agree? You go, oh yes, that was we are on the same page in knowing that was a weird situation. You had to, because if I was 19, I'm a year older than you, so you had to have been 18.
Right.
In the middle of this, trying to, I don't know.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm looking at you going, because we're doing Frontline at the time, and I looked at you thinking, is this the right thing to do? Like, I remember standing there going, is this the right thing?
Yeah.
And, you know, there's many times in my life where I'm sitting in the middle of things and I'm going, is this the right thing? Just because I'm standing there does not mean I'm signing off on it.
Right. Yeah.
But I'm trying to process, and especially being 19,
that's a lot, dude.
It's a lot. And this kid just needed counseling to probably find out, you know, why is he mad at his stepdad?
Right.
Probably for good reasons.
And we later on we found out it was for very good reasons. I'll probably do a follow-up. I just want to verify if any of that is true before I, really state it.
Step out there.
Yeah, but, we know that there was abuse for sure. And the betrayal of this happening from your mom, that's something that comes up with everyone I talk about, is that feeling of betrayal of a parent allowing these things to happen to you,
Who is trying to do the right thing spiritually by their child.
Right.
I see that side of it too, but it's misplaced.
Yeah.
And the damage is even worse because the parent is feeling like they're doing it out of perception of love, and it's
well, they feel like it's their only choice, right? Like, we're doing the hard thing because that's the only way, right? And
right. Oh yeah.
And I was a part of that many, many times where that was your one. I had an entire childhood of those kind of circumstances, and I'm telling you, I've said it before while we're getting caught up having a drink or whatever, but I really am very sorry that I exposed you to that and then even encouraged you to continue in it. Because I do vividly remember you looking at me like, bro, this is fucked. And I remember really kind of with an arrogance being like, just keep praying, dude. Just keep praying. Like you didn't understand. You were the only fucker that understood. The rest of us were like, we gonna get this demon, man. We gonna get it. And
if you notice, I never participated in demon expositions after that.
Yeah, the demons have been like, where'd that Tim guy go? He was great. He just showed up, kind of whispered in a corner. And that's always been part of the contradiction, is this God that is so amazing, that made all this. You can go on and on and on with all the sense of wonder and God, and the fact that he's been able to keep this Bible perfectly intact through all these centuries and all these people and everything. However, we're supposed to be scared to death of these demonic things. Like the contradiction about the power of the blood of Jesus, yet everybody's scared shitless over demons. It always confused me. It's like...
I, for one, have never been scared of demons.
Well, son, you were not raised right. Well, dude, I love you, man, and I appreciate you being willing to share this. I'm not going to reveal your identity, but you've always been the best friend to me. You were right there in the thick of it all, and I'm sure we'll have a few other podcasts, maybe a few interviews in person, but I appreciate you jumping on, man. I love you, buddy.
Yeah, wish I was closer, man.
All right.
See you, bud.
See ya.
All right, bye.
Love this episode of Spiritual PTSD Podcast? Head over to iTunes, Spotify, or Google to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. It's really helpful this early on in our podcast journey. And of course, don't forget to check out our website, spiritualptsd.com, for full interviews, event updates, and to join the conversation. Thank you. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and their guest. All facts and information has been stated as the host and their guest experience them and should not serve as a historical portrayal.